The world had shrunk to a circle of sandbags and a symphony of thunder. 71 hours. The number echoed in Airman Chloe Bennett's skull, a brutal metronome keeping time with her pounding heart. Her body was a foreign object, a heavy, trembling thing of aches and shivers. Through the rifle scope, the distant ridges of the Afghan mountains swam in a blur of heat and exhaustion. Her breath hitched, a ragged, dry sound lost in the whine of a passing round and the crump of its impact 50 yards downhill. Eyes open, whisper. Dawn is their favorite time for a bad surprise. The voice beside her was a gravelly rasp, stripped of all inflection by dust and fatigue. Sergeant Eva Morales didn't look at her. Her focus was absolute, her hands moving with a slow, oiled precision as they fed a fresh belt of 7.62mm ammunition into the M240B machine gun. The gesture was so practiced, so deeply ingrained, it seemed to happen independently of the woman herself. Ava's face was a mask of grime and dried sweat, her eyes 2 chips of flint staring out from under her helmet. She was a statue of resolve, but Chloe, in the hyper-aware state born of prolonged terror, saw the subtle tremor in the sergeant's forearm, the almost imperceptible sag of her shoulders. Chloe tried to swallow, but her throat was a desert. She gave a weak, jerky nod. "Eyes open," she whispered back, the words tasting like dust. She was Whisper, her call sign a cruel joke now. Her world had once been one of silent, air-conditioned rooms, of blinking server lights and the soft chatter of encrypted signals. She had been a ghost in the machine, tracing the digital footprints of men like the ones now trying to kill her. She had volunteered for this forward deployment to prove something, to her commanders, to her parents, but mostly to herself. Now, huddled in this dirt, the stench of cordite and her own fear thick in her nostrils, she knew she was proving something far more fundamental. The raw, animal will to survive. Another mortar shell landed, closer this time. The ground jumped, and a shower of pebbles and grit rained down on them. Chloe flinched, ducking her head instinctively. Ava didn't. She simply narrowed her eyes, her jaw tightening. "They're walking them in," Ava stated, her voice still that unnerving monotone. "Adjusting fire. Next one will be on our doorstep." She finally turned her head, her gaze sweeping over Chloe. It wasn't a look of pity or reassurance. It was an appraisal, cold and professional. She saw the blood-soaked field dressing on Chloe's arm, the way the younger woman cradled her M4 rifle like a lifeline. Eva's eyes lingered on the canteen clipped to Chloe's webbing. Without a word, Eva unclipped her own, the plastic scraping softly against the metal buckle. She held it out. "Drink," she ordered, the single word leaving no room for argument. Chloe's hands were shaking so badly she fumbled with the cap. Ava watched, not helping, just waiting. Finally, Chloe got it open and took a small, precious sip. The water was warm and tasted of plastic, but it was the most glorious thing she had ever tasted. She started to hand it back. "Keep it," Eva said, turning back to her machine gun. "You need it more." The simple act, the relinquishing of a vital resource, was more profound than any speech. It was a silent transfer of strength, a confirmation that they were in this, utterly and completely, together. In that moment, Chloe wasn't an airman and Eva wasn't a sergeant. They were just 2 women trapped in a tiny, crumbling circle of hell, passing a water canteen as the world exploded around them. The whine of the next incoming mortar was higher, sharper, promising everything Eva had said it would. Chloe screwed the cap back on the canteen, her movements suddenly a fraction steadier. She met Ava's stony profile, took a deep, shuddering breath, and raised her rifle back to the sandbag wall. The dawn was coming, and so were they. The memory hit Eva with the force of a physical blow, a stark and unwelcome intrusion in the lull between mortar rounds. It wasn't a full scene, just a sensation, the climate-controlled chill of a darkened room in Nevada, the smooth, cool feel of a joystick under her thumb, and the sterile digital glow of a monitor displaying a convoy of pixelated vehicles. On her headset, a voice crackled, calm and clear. "Reaper, you are cleared hot." Her index finger had depressed a button. On the screen, a silent, blooming flower of light. A mission success. A confirmed kill. She had felt nothing but the mild satisfaction of a task completed. followed by the thought of the coffee waiting in the break room. The irony was a bitter taste in her mouth now, sharper than the dust. She, who had once delivered death from an antiseptic distance of 8,000 miles, was now trapped in the gritty, intimate reality of it. The sand was in her teeth, the concussions physically pounded her chest, and the fear was a live wire in her gut. This was what her little brother Miguel had known. This grunt's eye view of war. He'd written her letters from a place just like this, scrawled on dirty paper, talking about the dust and the noise and the bone-deep tiredness. He'd signed his last one. "Don't worry, big sis. It's a little busy here, but we've got it." They'd been overrun an hour later. A spray of machine gun fire ripped into the sandbags above her head, snapping her back to the present. She returned fire, 3-round bursts, her movements mechanical. Her world had narrowed to the arc of her machine gun's traverse. This was her penance. She had requested the transfer to infantry, to a forward post, despite the raised eyebrows and outright protests from her command. A top-tier drone pilot was an asset to be protected. But Ava couldn't stand the protection anymore. She needed to feel the war she had orchestrated for so long. She needed to understand what Miguel had felt in his final moments. Her eyes flicked to the woman beside her. Airman Chloe Bennett. Whisper. The file had said she was a prodigy, a linguistic savant pulled from an accelerated program at Yale. She could decipher the subtle nuances in enemy communications, could trace a shadow network through its digital whispers. She had volunteered for this, too. Ava had initially seen her as a liability, another piece of sensitive equipment to be babysat. But the kid had grit. The sniper's round that had sliced her arm had barely gotten a whimper. Now, she was scanning the terrain with a pair of battered binoculars. Her good arm braced against the sandbags, her face a pale, determined mask under the grime. "They're repositioning," Chloe said, her voice hoarse but surprisingly steady. She didn't sound like a college kid anymore. She sounded like a soldier. I heard the command. "They're massing for a push on the eastern corner. They think we're weak there." Ava didn't question it. In the last 70 hours, every piece of intel Chloe had pulled from the chaotic ether had been correct. The analyst was reading the battlefield like one of her code books. "They're wrong," Eva grunted, shifting the heavy barrel of the M240B a few degrees to the east. She ejected a partially spent belt and slammed a new one home with a solid thunk. The metallic clatter was a promise of violence. "Let's make sure they understand that." She glanced at Chloe, a flicker of something that wasn't just tactical appraisal. It was the beginning of respect. This wasn't the war of silent digital screens Ava had known. This was a war of shared canteens, of whispered warnings, of two women holding a line against the storm. And in this brutal, intimate conflict, Ava Morales was finally, terribly, home. The silence was the first warning. It wasn't a true silence, but a sudden, unnerving drop in the volume of war. The sporadic cracks of rifle fire from the ridges ceased. The constant background thrum of distant engagements faded away. All that remained was the low moan of the wind and the frantic, buzzing whine of a trapped fly near Chloe's ear. She lowered her binoculars, her blood running cold despite the oppressive heat. This was it. "The pressure dropped before the hurricane! Reaper!" she whispered, the words scraping her raw throat. "The chatter. It's gone. Completely. They've gone radio silent." Ava didn't need the translation. Her body, tuned by 3 days of relentless combat, understood the language of the lull. It was the collective intake of breath before a scream. She gave a single sharp nod, her eyes never leaving the eastern approach. The ground there was a gentle slope, scarred by craters and littered with the dark, twisted remains of previous assaults. It was a killing field, and they were the only ones left to guard it. "Positions," Eva commanded, her voice a low growl that carried more authority than a shout. "They're coming up the draw. They think the silence will make us careless." She racked the charging handle on the M240B, the sound brutally loud in the quiet. "Let's disappoint them." Chloe's heart hammered against her ribs, a frantic bird trapped in a cage of bone and Kevlar. She fumbled a fresh magazine into her rifle, her injured arm screaming in protest as she slammed it home. The fear was a physical thing, a cold weight in her stomach. She thought of her parents' tidy living room in Iowa, the smell of fresh coffee and baking bread. It felt like a memory from another lifetime, a dream belonging to someone else. She squeezed her eyes shut for a fraction of a second, forcing the image away. There was no Iowa here. There was only the dirt, the sandbags, and the woman beside her. Then she saw them. Not a scattered line, but a dark, flowing mass like ants pouring from a disturbed nest. Dozens of them, maybe more, emerging from the folds in the terrain, their movement swift and purposeful. They were no longer probing. They were committing. Contact! East! 200 meters and closing! Chloe yelled, her voice cracking but clear. She brought her rifle up, the stock pressing into her shoulder, a familiar anchor in the rising chaos. Eva's world shrank to her weapon sights. The first man in the advancing line filled her view. She exhaled slowly, a shooter's breath, and squeezed the trigger. The machine gun roared to life, its staccato thunder shattering the false peace. The figure dropped. She traversed the barrel, a steady, mechanical motion. Another burst. Another target fell. She was no longer a woman named Ava. She was a function, a terrible and efficient equation of cause and effect. The enemy line rippled but did not break. They returned fire, a storm of lead that whipped overhead and smacked into the sandbags with sickening thuds. Dirt and stone chips filled the air. Chloe joined in, firing controlled pairs into the advancing mass. It was like trying to stop a tidal wave with a pebble. The distance was closing, 100 meters. She could see the individual shapes of their uniforms now, the glint of their eyes. An RPG round streaked in from the north, exploding against the outer perimeter wire with a deafening blast that sent a shockwave through their position. The concussive force knocked Chloe sideways. Her helmet slammed against the sandbag, stars exploding in her vision. Her ears rang with a high-pitched whine, drowning out all other sound. Through the disorienting haze, she saw Ava, still firing, still unwavering. But Chloe saw something else. A flicker of movement to their far left, a smaller group attempting to flank them while the main force kept them pinned. They would be overrun in minutes. She tried to shout a warning, but her voice was a ragged gasp, lost in the ringing and the gunfire. She scrambled on her knees, grabbing a grenade from her webbing. Her hands were shaking so badly she could barely pull the pin. She took a breath, thought of Ava's steady hands on the machine gun, and threw it. The explosion was small, but the flanking group scattered, seeking cover. She had bought them seconds, just seconds, and the main force was still coming. The world snapped back into focus with a vicious clarity, the ringing in Chloe's ears replaced by the raw, unmediated roar of the battle. Her head throbbed where it had hit the sandbag, a dull, insistent pain that layered over the sharper agony in her arm. She blinked, pushing back the dizziness, and saw Ava, a statue of relentless fury behind the machine gun. Brass shell casings spewed from the weapon, piling up around her boots like a carpet of gleaming, spent hope. The advancing line had slowed, forced to ground by the accurate. Withering fire, but they were still there. Close enough now that Chloe could hear their guttural shouts over the gunfire. A new sound cut through the din, a sound that froze the blood in her veins. It was the distinct, metallic pop-clank of a grenade launcher from the enemy lines. Her eyes, wide with a fresh wave of terror, tracked the faint smoke trail. The projectile arced high, a small dark dot against the bleached sky, its trajectory unmistakable. It was going to clear the sandbag wall. It was going to land right in their fighting position. Time seemed to warp, stretching and slowing. She saw Ava completely focused on the threat to the front, unaware of the death descending from above. There was no time to shout, no time for a warning. There was only instinct. A raw, unthinking impulse forged in the last 72 hours of shared hardship and silent understanding. Chloe launched herself forward, not away from the explosion, but toward Ava. It wasn't a heroic, dramatic leap, but a desperate, graceless lunge. She slammed into Eva's side, driving them both away from the machine gun and into the dirt at the back of the emplacement. The world turned white, then black, then red. The grenade detonated with a concussive whoomp that sucked the air from their lungs. The blast was a physical thing, a giant's fist hammering down on them. Shrapnel whizzed overhead, shredding the sandbags where Ava's head had been just a second before. Dirt, stone, and hot metal fragments rained down on them. A searing hot pain like a brand scored across Chloe's back, just above her body armor. She cried out, a short, sharp gasp lost in the aftermath of the blast. The smell of cordite and burnt fabric filled her nostrils. For a moment they lay in a tangled heap, the breath crushed from their bodies. Eva was the first to move, shoving Chloe off her with a grunt. Her eyes, wide and wild, scanned the younger woman, taking in the new bloody tear in her uniform, the pale, shocky look on her face. Then her gaze darted to their machine gun. It was tilted at a crazy angle, its bipod buried under collapsed sandbags, a long, ugly scar gouged into the receiver by a piece of shrapnel. "They're coming!" Chloe choked out, the words a painful rasp. She could see the enemy fighters beginning to rise, sensing the sudden cessation of the heavy fire, starting their final victorious charge. Eva's face hardened into a mask of grim fury. She scrambled back to the weapon, heaving the damaged sandbags aside. She wrestled the heavy machine gun back into position, her hands moving over the scarred metal, checking the feed tray. It was jammed, a twisted cartridge lodged in the mechanism. They were defenseless. Eva abandoned the big gun in an instant, grabbing her M4 rifle. She looked at Chloe, who was struggling to sit up, her own rifle held in a white-knuckled grip. The enemy was 50 meters away, closing fast, their shouts now clear and triumphant. "On me!" Eva yelled, her voice cutting through the fog in Chloe's mind. "Aim for the chest! Make every shot count!" They rose together, two figures silhouetted against the smoke and dust, their world reduced to the few yards of broken earth they stood upon. There would be no retreat, no rescue. There was only this final desperate act of defiance. As one, they brought their rifles to their shoulders, and the sharp, quicker cracks of their M4s joined the roar of the enemy's advance, a final fragile thread of resistance against the coming tide. The first shot from Eva's rifle was a statement. It took the lead fighter square in the chest, dropping him mid-stride. The second shot was a promise, finding its mark in the shoulder of another, spinning him around. Beside her, Chloe fired, her breaths coming in short, sharp gasps that matched the rhythm of her trigger pulls. She wasn't aiming, not in the conscious way she'd been taught. This was something deeper, a primal instinct to survive, to push back against the darkness for one more second, one more breath. The advancing line hesitated, shocked by the sudden, accurate fire from a position they thought neutralized. That hesitation was all the gift they would get. Eva's rifle clicked empty. She dropped the magazine with practiced speed, slamming a new one home without ever taking her eyes from the enemy. Chloe did the same, her movements a clumsy echo of Eva's fluidity. The charging fighters, now 30 meters out, saw the lull and surged forward again, their own rifles blazing. This was it, the end of the line. Eva felt a strange, cold calm settle over her. There would be no more decisions, no more regrets. There was only the next target. She picked a man with an RPG on his shoulder and squeezed the trigger, but the shot never came. From behind them, from the high ground to the west, a new sound erupted. It was the beautiful, brutal, and overwhelming roar of a .50 caliber heavy machine gun. Tracers, thick as ropes of fire, scythed through the advancing enemy line, chewing through bodies and equipment with indiscriminate fury. The charge disintegrated into a scene of utter chaos and carnage. Men were thrown backward, others dove for cover that did not exist against such firepower. Eva and Chloe stood frozen, their rifles still shouldered, staring at the sudden, violent salvation unfolding before them. Then, from the same direction, came the sharper, faster reports of M4s and the distinct, powerful boom of a squad automatic weapon. A team of U.S. Army Rangers, clad in dusty combat gear, moved with lethal precision along the ridge, flanking the shattered enemy force and cutting down any remaining resistance. The firefight, which had raged for what felt like an eternity, was over in less than a minute. The silence that followed was profound, broken only by the crackle of burning debris and the distant, fading shouts of the Rangers as they secured the area. The smoke began to slowly drift away on the wind, revealing the horrifying tableau of the battlefield. Chloe's legs gave out first. She sank to her knees, her rifle clattering to the ground beside her. She stared blankly at the torn earth, her body beginning to shake uncontrollably, the adrenaline receding and leaving a vast, hollow emptiness in its wake. The pain in her arm and back flared into a white-hot agony now that the immediate threat was gone. Eva remained standing for a long moment, her eyes scanning the scene, her mind struggling to catch up. The sight of the Rangers, the sound of American voices. It felt alien, like a dream after the stark reality of the last 3 days. Her gaze fell on Chloe, kneeling and shaking, and the cold soldier inside her receded. She knelt beside the younger woman, her own hands trembling now that the fight was over. She didn't speak. There were no words. She simply placed a firm, steadying hand on Chloe's good shoulder. The physical contact was an anchor. Chloe flinched at first, then leaned into the touch, a single ragged sob escaping her lips. She didn't look at Eva, just kept her eyes fixed on the ground, but her hand came up and gripped Ava's forearm, her knuckles white. They stayed like that, kneeling in the dirt amidst the wreckage of their position, 2 women held together by a silence more powerful than any prayer. The first fragile threads of a bond that could only be forged in the crucible of shared survival. The long night was over. Now they had to learn how to live in the dawn. The arrival of the Rangers was a blur of controlled chaos. A medic was beside them in an instant, his face young and grim as he assessed their wounds. Chloe's back was a mess of superficial shrapnel cuts. Her arm wound needed proper cleaning and stitches. Eva had a deep gash on her forehead she didn't even remember getting. They were patched up with efficient, impersonal kindness, wrapped in thermal blankets as the shock began to set in. A burly staff sergeant with a thick beard stood over their shattered position, whistling softly. "Hell of a stand, Sergeant," he said to Eva, his voice laced with genuine respect. "We tracked the comms blackout. Knew it was bad. Didn't think anyone was still breathing." Eva just nodded, her throat too tight to form words. They were helped to their feet and guided up the slope to where the Rangers had established a hasty perimeter. The world outside their sandbagged universe seemed impossibly large and bright. The sky was a piercing, clean blue, a cruel contrast to the hell they had just endured. The sound of the Black Hawk helicopters grew from a distant thrum to a deafening roar as they descended in a storm of swirling dust and deafening noise. The downwash from the rotors was a physical force. Whipping the thermal blankets around their legs, a crew chief, his helmeted face anonymous behind his visor, reached out a hand to help Chloe into the chopper's dark belly. She hesitated, her body recoiling from the machine, her feet seemingly rooted to the ground. The noise, the vibration, the sheer violence of the helicopter's presence, it was too much. It felt like an extension of the battlefield, another metal beast screaming at her. Her breathing hitched, her eyes wide with a fresh, primal fear. Eva, standing just behind her, saw the panic seize the younger woman. She moved forward, not grabbing her, but placing herself between Chloe and the yawning door of the helicopter. She leaned in, her mouth close to Chloe's ear, her voice a low, steady murmur that cut through the rotor wash. "Look at me, Whisper." Chloe's terrified eyes snapped to hers. "It's just a ride home," Eva said, her gaze holding Chloe's, unwavering and solid. "One last noisy ride. You've already survived the worst part. This is the easy bit." She didn't smile. She didn't offer false comfort. She simply stated it as a fact, her own exhaustion and resolve creating a bubble of calm in the maelstrom. Chloe stared at her for a long moment, seeing the blood stain on the fresh bandage on Ava's forehead, the absolute certainty in her weary eyes. She took a deep, shuddering breath, then another. The panic receded, not gone, but manageable. She gave a single sharp nod. Eva climbed in first, turning and offering her hand. This time, Chloe took it, her grip surprisingly strong. She let Eva pull her up and into the relative darkness of the cabin. They were strapped into the red nylon seats by the crew chief, the harnesses clicking shut with a finality that felt both terrifying and profoundly relieving. The helicopter lifted off, the ground falling away beneath them. Chloe kept her eyes locked on Eva, who sat across from her, her own gaze turned to look out the open door. The outpost, Vigilance, became a small, sad scar on the landscape, a tiny circle of broken sandbags and scorched earth. The ridges that had held death for 3 days were now just beautiful, barren mountains. As the helicopter banked, turning toward the safety of the main base, Eva finally looked away from the window. Her eyes met Chloe's across the vibrating cabin. The roar of the engines made speech impossible, but none was needed. In that shared look was the entire unspoken story. The fear, the trust, the shared sips of water, the grenade blast, the final desperate stand. They had been to the very edge of the abyss together, and they had walked back. They were no longer sergeant and airman. They were Eva and Chloe. And as the helicopter carried them away from the fire, they both knew with a certainty that went deeper than bone, that a part of them would forever remain in that dusty, blood-soaked circle forever bound by 72 hours under fire. The C-17 Globemaster was a cavernous, roaring beast, a world away from the claustrophobic intensity of the Black Hawk. Strapped into webbing seats along the fuselage, they were just 2 more figures in the dim red light amongst dozens of other returning personnel. Some slept, their heads lolling with the vibration of the aircraft. Others stared into the middle distance, their eyes holding the same hollow look that Eva saw in the reflective surface of a fire extinguisher across from her. The plane was a cargo of ghosts, each carrying their own private war home. Chloe sat beside her, her head resting against the vibrating fuselage wall, her eyes closed. But Eva knew she wasn't sleeping. She could see the subtle tension in her jaw, the way her good hand would occasionally clench and unclench on her thigh. The sleeping pill at the field hospital had granted them a few hours of numb oblivion, but now, hurtling through the sky away from the war zone, the real work was beginning. The remembering. Eva's own mind was a minefield. She would close her eyes and be back in the drone control room, the chill of the air conditioning raising goosebumps on her arms. Then, in a blink, she was back in the dust. The heat, the deafening noise, Miguel's face superimposing itself over Chloe's. She had gone to that outpost to face her brother's ghost, to understand his sacrifice. She had never expected to find a reason to live alongside it. She felt a gentle pressure on her arm. She looked down. Chloe's hand had come to rest there, her fingers not gripping, just resting. A point of contact, an anchor. Chloe didn't open her eyes, but a single tear escaped from beneath her lid and traced a path through the lingering pallor of exhaustion on her cheek. Eva didn't pull away. She let the warmth of the touch seep through the sleeve of her uniform. She looked around the darkened cabin at the rows of silent, weary soldiers. They were all alone with their demons. But she and Chloe, they weren't. They had a witness, someone who had been there, who had seen the worst and the best of each other. Someone who knew that heroism wasn't a grand gesture, but the simple, brutal act of not giving up, of passing a canteen, of throwing a grenade with a shattered arm, of lunging into the path of death for a person you barely knew. The plane began its slow, gradual descent. The change in pressure popped in their ears. Around them, soldiers began to stir, stretching stiff limbs, their movements sluggish with more than just fatigue. It was the heaviness of transition, the uncertain shift from a world of absolute life and death purpose to the confusing quiet of the one they were returning to. Chloe finally opened her eyes. They were red-rimmed and tired, but the terror that had lived in them for 72 hours was gone. In its place was a deep, settled sorrow and a quiet, unbreakable strength. She looked at Eva, and for the first time, a faint, fragile smile touched her lips. It didn't reach her eyes, not quite, but it was a start. Eva found herself returning it with a slow nod. No words passed between them. None were needed. The roar of the engines began to soften as the wheels locked into place. Out the small window, the lights of the airbase in Germany sprawled out like a field of fallen stars, a pattern of order and safety that felt both welcoming and alien. The wheels touched down with a shriek of rubber and a jolt that ran through the frame of the massive aircraft. It was over. The mission, the fire, the long watch, they had survived. As the plane taxied, Eva reached into a pocket on her torn and stained combat shirt. She pulled out a small, creased photograph, its edges softened from wear. It was a picture of her brother, Miguel, smiling in his own uniform, taken a lifetime ago. She looked at it for a long moment, then not at the picture but through it. She then looked at Chloe, who was watching her with a quiet understanding. Eva tucked the photo back into her pocket. She wasn't leaving him behind in the Afghan dirt. She was carrying him home, just as she was carrying the woman beside her, and the woman beside her was carrying her. They were each other's cargo now. Their war was over. Their survival had just begun. And as the plane came to a final stop and the rear ramp began to lower, letting in the cool dawn air of a new day, they unbuckled their harnesses and stood up, side by side, ready to walk out into the light, together. The C-17 Globemaster was a cavernous, roaring beast, a world away from the claustrophobic intensity of the Black Hawk. Strapped into webbing seats along the fuselage, they were just two more figures in the dim red light amongst dozens of other returning personnel. Some slept, their heads lolling with the vibration of the aircraft. Others stared into the middle distance, their eyes holding the same hollow look that Ava saw in the reflective surface of a fire extinguisher across from her. The plane was a cargo of ghosts, each carrying their own private war home. Chloe sat beside her, her head resting against the vibrating fuselage wall, her eyes closed. But Ava knew she wasn't sleeping. She could see the subtle tension in her jaw, the way her good hand would occasionally clench and unclench on her thigh. The sleeping pill at the field hospital had granted them a few hours of numb oblivion, but now, hurtling through the sky away from the war zone, the real work was beginning. The remembering. Eva's own mind was a minefield. She would close her eyes and be back in the drone control room, the chill of the air conditioning raising goosebumps on her arms. Then, in a blink, she was back in the dust. The heat, the deafening noise, Miguel's face superimposing itself over Chloe's. She had gone to that outpost to face her brother's ghost, to understand his sacrifice. She had never expected to find a reason to live alongside it. She felt a gentle pressure on her arm. She looked down. Chloe's hand had come to rest there, her fingers not gripping, just resting. A point of contact, an anchor. Chloe didn't open her eyes, but a single tear escaped from beneath her lid and traced a path through the lingering pallor of exhaustion on her cheek. Eva didn't pull away. She let the warmth of the touch seep through the sleeve of her uniform. She looked around the darkened cabin at the rows of silent, weary soldiers. They were all alone with their demons. But she and Chloe, they weren't. They had a witness, someone who had been there, who had seen the worst and the best of each other. Someone who knew that heroism wasn't a grand gesture, but the simple, brutal act of not giving up, of passing a canteen, of throwing a grenade with a shattered arm, of lunging into the path of death for a person you barely knew. The plane began its slow, gradual descent. The change in pressure popped in their ears. Around them, soldiers began to stir, stretching stiff limbs, their movements sluggish with more than just fatigue. It was the heaviness of transition, the uncertain shift from a world of absolute life and death purpose to the confusing quiet of the one they were returning to. Chloe finally opened her eyes. They were red-rimmed and tired, but the terror that had lived in them for 72 hours was gone. In its place was a deep, settled sorrow and a quiet, unbreakable strength. She looked at Ava, and for the first time, a faint, fragile smile touched her lips. It didn't reach her eyes, not quite, but it was a start. Eva found herself returning it with a slow nod. No words passed between them. None were needed. The roar of the engines began to soften as the wheels locked into place. Out the small window, the lights of the airbase in Germany sprawled out like a field of fallen stars, a pattern of order and safety that felt both welcoming and alien. The wheels touched down with a shriek of rubber and a jolt that ran through the frame of the massive aircraft. It was over. The mission, the fire, the long watch, they had survived. As the plane taxied, Eva reached into a pocket on her torn and stained combat shirt. She pulled out a small, creased photograph, its edges softened from wear. It was a picture of her brother, Miguel, smiling in his own uniform, taken a lifetime ago. She looked at it for a long moment, then not at the picture, but through it. She then looked at Chloe, who was watching her with a quiet understanding. Eva tucked the photo back into her pocket. She wasn't leaving him behind in the Afghan dirt. She was carrying him home just as she was carrying the woman beside her, and the woman beside her was carrying her. They were each other's cargo now. Their war was over. Their survival had just begun. And as the plane came to a final stop and the rear ramp began to lower, letting in the cool dawn air of a new day, they unbuckled their harnesses and stood up side by side, ready to walk out into the light together.